Okay, welcome everyone to the 37th episode of the SFU Sports our series. Pfaff University to talk to us today about soccer controlling ball progression. So Dr. Pfaff is an assistant professor of mathematics at Queen's in Ontario. Graduated from the University of Chicago with an honors mathematics degree, earned her PhD from the University of Brunswick, geometric guiding the Mosher. Before holding her current position, she was one of two laboratoires d'excellence postdoctoral research fellows in mathematics and computer science at the Université de Marseille, postdoctoral research fellow at Yalefield, and then being assistant professor of mathematics at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Have lots of interesting academic adventures by the sounds of it. She's a proud co-advisor of two PhD students and a master's student, collaborator in the PNC Collaborative Research Team, Sports Analytics, co-host of the Friends of Tracking Educational Soccer Analytics channel. In terms of her talk, so they're going to, the underlying philosophy behind their work is that it is most difficult to disrupt an attacking team's progression forward the ball when this attacking team has multiple good options at each moment in time. With this in mind, they will examine how soccer players can use their spatial relationships to control safely play up chains of safe configurations of players on a team, ensuring the possessor of the ball has a collection of open passing options, all connected by open passing lanes. We'll then create a directed weighted graph to encode all such chains of safe configurations, as well as analyze which configurations lead to a loss of possession. So this work is joint with Dr. Hao-Ji Hong, Forstel, Alkov, Zoe Rassenauer, and Tim Chan. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Pfaff to talk. Much,
okay. Thank you. Okay, so thank you for the introduction. So this is joint work with myself and then Emily Hunter Hausi, who also goes by Howie Hong, Daniel Forstel, Ari Fyalkov, Zoe Dassenauer, and Timothy Chan. And today I'll be presenting in combination with Howie, Ari, and Zoe. And so, without further ado, so the goals of our work, or the two of the goals of our work. So one is that we want to study how configurations of players can evolve to positive effect. So what do we mean by that? So two ways that you could say positive effect would be progressing the ball up the field, maybe from the defensive to attacking third, without losing possession, like in a way that one considers safe, or progressing the ball into the box. So here's a chain of progression that will come up later. Another thing that we're interested in is understanding which configurations one may want to avoid or defensively disrupt, which can have also coaching applications and so on. And so I'll give a little preview now of what kind of the model is that'll achieve this goal, and then we'll talk about the different pieces that build it. So if this doesn't make sense now, that's okay. You can just have it in your mind that this is where we're going. So what we create is a directed weighted graph. So the vertices, the objects that we're kind of interested in, are going to be what we're going to call safe configurations of players. And you'll learn about what those are. And then we want to know, so the edges then are going to be encoding, historically, has one been able to shift from this configuration to that configuration? So could we find this in our data? So that's going to be kind of this graph that we're going to create. And then there's going to be weights, which are going to have to do with how frequently do we actually, or do we find in the data that one shifted from that configuration to that configuration? Okay. And then, so how is this talk going to kind of proceed to get you to understanding our model? So one of the things we're going to need to understand is where in the field can one safely pass to. So that'll be passable regions. And then we're going to look at tracking data and computing, how we actually go about computing these regions, and then what we're going to call the safe configurations, as well as a little bit of the data that we worked with was unfortunately what we would call wonky. And so, which is also some restrictions on our evidence and so on. So Zoe's going to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about how we want to actually categorize these configurations, because, you know, it's too much information to have all of the safe configurations. It's like too much to work with, whereas some configurations are actually really similar. So we're going to use clustering to kind of categorize the configurations. So one is dealing with less configurations and has a better picture of what's going on. And then we're going to construct from that safe configuration graph I was just talking about, which encodes what the safe configurations are, and then how you can move from one configuration to another. And then Ari is going to go through some examples. There's going to be, one can add into the safe configuration graph a lose the ball node, so kind of recording a loss of possession. And he's going to kind of focus in on some configurations that could lead to a loss of possession like this, as well as he's going to talk about, you know, one of the things that you have with the graph is you don't just look at the individual edges, you can now all of a sudden look at chains. So I shift from this configuration to this configuration, and then it might have happened in a different time that one could shift from this configuration to this configuration and so on. But then one can actually kind of trace how one can move through the configurations, or one can look at how one has moved through the configurations, particularly in Ari's example, succeeding in making it into the 18-yard box. And then we're going to give the supporting evidence we had, which again, it's, you know, unfortunately for this paper, we were lucky to have data, but it was a little wonky. So most of the tests we wanted to run, we actually kind of weren't able to, but we did find one test that we could run that was some evidence supporting that this kind of clickiness, as we're going to call it, is actually good, leads to success. Okay. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about and I think that our model has a lot of possible applications as well as expansions for future work. So always we're hoping that this is just a launch off point. This idea of this model can lead to a lot of new work and applications and so on. So I'll talk about a few of those that I particularly had in mind. Okay, and then this is a funny, sorry, I'm going to adjust this somehow or another. That was a very funny mode I had that in. So before anything else, we're going to talk about passable regions. And I'm going to start this. So passable regions are going to be where one can pass the ball to without much chance of interception or losing it. And this is, in some senses, is just a adjustment of some previous models. So I first want to say, so there are two kind of well-known previous models that are related to this one. They're dominance regions. The first one, so I learned about this from Soccermatics. If I recall correctly, rumor has it that teams were using this perhaps before, though David Sumter writing Soccermatics may not have, if I recall correctly, individually saw that this was what was going on with certain teams. So what would Voronoi diagrams be? So if you have if you look at a blue dot there, then the region around it is a region, like each, place within that region is closer to that particular blue dot than to any of the other dots. So it's kind of a notion of, okay, that player more or less can get to anywhere in that region before any other player. A more sophisticated model, much more sophisticated model, was created by William Spearman, analyst for Liverpool FC now, but also a physicist. So he incorporated more physics into the model. So it includes, for example, in pitch control model, the velocity of the player, the direction they're going in, and so on. But it's still kind of this notion of, who can reach where on the field first. Now, these were great. We wanted a slight adjustment to what was going on because what we're really interested in are what we're going to call safe passing lanes, where, passing lanes where it's not likely to be intercepted. So with that in mind, Howie's going to tell us about passable regions. Okay, so Howie.
Sorry, I think you need to stop sharing screen. Can you start? Okay. Similar to the pitch control model, we assign points on the field to certain teams based on the time required something to reach a particular location. In passable region model, we account for velocity acceleration of the players and the acceleration and velocity of the ball. Unlike the pitch control model, we consider the time required for the ball to reach a particular location from the current location and determine whether a location is safe to pass, hence the name passable region. The figure shown on the screen is an example of passable region graph. In this case, the red player is the attacking team and the area shaded in red is controlled by the red team. The conservation of the ball is important for our purpose. Imagine player A try to pass the ball to player B. There seems to be a clear passing link between A and B. However, the ball will be intersected because the blue team can reach the middle of the lane before the ball. Now I will hand this back to Professor Clark for the talk.
Okay. Okay, so, oops. Okay, so the next thing, so now that we have this notion of where you could pass to in a safe manner, Zoe's going to tell us about both the tracking data, kind of how it works, and its wonkiness, and also what then we would consider to be a safe configuration, which will then be a node in this graph. Okay, so without further ado, Zoe.
Okay, so yes, let's start by just introducing the tracking data. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with tracking data, but it's always good to recap. Essentially, for a given game, there is cameras located around the field, and every 25 times a second, they're going to take an image, and there's going to be some artificial intelligence model that extracts the location of each player, the velocity of each player, the location of the ball, the velocity of the ball, and then also which team is in possession. And this last thing is sort of especially useful for us because determining which team is in possession is somewhat of a nuanced thing, but for us, we can just read it directly out of the data. Now, you'll notice that two of these things have asterisks. And the reason for that is, unfortunately, very frequently, the cameras or the AI model, or rather, when the data is presented to us, in quite a large number of the frames, the position of the ball is simply unknown. Or similarly, the team in possession is unknown. This obviously creates limitations because to compute the passable regions, you obviously need to know where the ball is. And as well, the passable regions, really depend on the attacking team, because of course, if you're not in possession, you can't pass. And so if either possession is unknown or the location of the ball is unknown, we really can't do the computations that we need. And unfortunately, this happens quite often. But when it does when all these things are known, we can proceed sort of naturally. Okay, so with that out of the way, passing cliques and configurations. Let's talk about that. As Howie introduced, we can start from our raw frame data, and we can compute the safe passing space. We have this circle that's created by the fact that the ball, slows down as it travels across the ground, can't go further than this, and then we have these small regions of influence for each defender. Outside of those areas, we can pass safely. And so we want to go from this to computing safe passing lanes. And so once we have the region, we can sort of iterate over all of the players. And if two players have a line between them that is entirely within the safe passing space, we consider that to be a passing lane, even if the player does not have the ball at the moment. And the reason for this is in theory, if they were to receive the ball sort of instantaneously by magic, then they would be able to pass. And so we can go from the raw frame data to the passable regions to computing the passing lanes. And then from there, we can find cliques. So we can find small groups of players that could all pass to each other. And so for the frame in question, there's two sort of families of cliques. There's this group of 3 here, and then there's this group of 4 here. And of course, this group of 4 has 3 triangles which compose it. And so we say that this 4 clique is made up of 3 individual 3 cliques. Once we have all the cliques in a frame, we can combine them to get what we call a safe configuration. And so the configuration really takes into account all the players who were involved in some clique in the frame, as well as special information about which one of them has the ball. So how do we actually compute these things? Well, we're going to use sort of a known algorithm for, given an arbitrary graph, finding all the cliques. And so step 1 is, of course, to identify the passing lanes. This thing is all about passing lanes. We then identify the ball carrier, who's marked in green. And we do this by first reading who's in possession out of the data. And then we just pick the attacking player who's closest to the ball. And we're going to require the players within 1 meter. If they're more than 1 meter away, then, of course, they can't pass. So this is just a small requirement we have to impose. We then find the cliques of size 2. And so what is a clique of size 2? Well, it's just 2 players where they can pass to each other. So these are really the passing lanes. And of course, we want our passing cliques to involve the ball player. So we start with the ball player. We find the potential 2 cliques. And so the potential 2 clique players are sort of highlighted in pink here. We can pick an individual 2 clique and extend it to a 3 clique by selecting one of these players and finding someone who can pass to both of them. And so these are the 3 players here, highlighted in yellow. We can select one of these players, and now we have a 3 clique. And now we just repeat the process. We identify players that can pass to all 3 of these. So this is one such player. And then we repeat this process. We can go from 4 to 5 by identifying a player that can pass to all 4 of these, 5 to 6, etc. And by doing this, we're going to find all the 2 cliques, all the 3 cliques, all the 4 cliques, all the 5 cliques, etc. Once you hit 11, of course, you can stop, and then you have all the cliques. We then combine them. That gives us the configuration. And yeah, combining. So I think this is a good moment to just pause because this is sort of the end of the foundations. Does anyone have questions just about what we've done so far?
I have a question. So you may have mentioned this, but what data are you using? Like what league or team or?
We're using the Allsvenskan men's data, which is the Swedish league from, I believe, 2020. Someone can correct me if I'm getting the year wrong, but yeah.
So do you just have the whole league's worth of data or just the one team?
We have the whole league for that one season. We focused on Mjällby AIF. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. I don't speak Swedish. But we focused on Mjällby just because doing full analysis of, it's gigabytes and gigabytes and gigabytes of data. So doing a full processing on all of it, and sometimes was a little out of reach. As well, the issues with the data missing, we found that Mjällby tended to have more consistent data.
Oh, okay, yeah. That was going to ask. It's like, can you tell a difference between when they're home or away, or do you only have home data or away data?
So alongside the tracking data, we get sort of like a game info file, which tells us the day that the game was played, the dimensions of the stadium. We find out who's home away. We find the starting rosters. We actually have information about all the substitutions, the jersey numbers. The data is actually incredibly rich. It just so happens that the position of the ball is sort of a difficult thing.
Yeah, no, for sure.
And actually, so we as in another student working on our master's with myself and another professor, we just got access to a lot of probably much better data. At the time, this was what we had access to, so we worked with it. We could conceivably rerun a lot of stuff with better data, but also I feel like we're setting up a framework that maybe hopefully as people get access to better data, they can do more things with. But
Yeah, no, I feel your pain.
I think everybody knows.
Yeah.
I think this is the well-known thing. The other thing I wanted to mention, so we're calling these safe configurations with the underlying philosophy that if somebody in possession of the ball has a lot of options, it's harder to stop them from doing, from progressing. And then we're putting 2 steps into this so that not only do they have a lot of options, but whomever they pass to has options also. So this was kind of our idea behind creating the safe configurations. Okay.
Thanks.
So back to where we're going. So that was safe configurations. Again, the idea being that we have configurations where there's a lot of possibility, so that you can see, like, hopefully they should be able to continue to progress the ball. And these will be the nodes of the graph. And then the next thing that we're going to talk about is, as I was saying before, we don't want to just take all the configurations and consider them to be different if they're actually quite similar to each other or effectively the same. So we go through a method of clustering or kind of categorizing the configurations and then considering everything in a particular category to be a single configuration. So Howie's going to talk about this. I want to give a heads up that I feel this is probably the most technical aspect of the talk. So if this is not your wheelhouse and you zone out during it, you probably will be able to catch, like, to be fine in the future. So if you want to take a moment to zone out on this, or you can pay attention and learn from it. So Howie will talk about how we actually do this.
Okay, so let me first introduce what a clustering algorithm is. So a clustering algorithm could divide a set of points based on their similarity. If a suitable cluster algorithm is chosen, data point in the same cluster should be more similar than other data points. There are many different clustering algorithms online. Here is an overview of cluster algorithm available in a Python package called sklearn. The cluster algorithm we will use in the example today is optics. So in order to use this optic clustering algorithm, we will need a notion of distance between the configuration. So we will use these 2 configurations on the screen as our example. Configuration A and configuration B are from the same soccer game. And then configuration B is about 2 seconds after configuration A. But configuration B is somewhat different from configuration A. So the red player on top of configuration A is blocked by the blue player in configuration B. Instead, the two player on the bottom of the configuration form a configuration with the other red player. The shape and the location of the player of these 2 configurations are somewhat different from each other, and we want to define a notion of distance to capture this kind of difference. To define this distance, we create an image or a matrix of a frame based on the location of the player in the configuration. We then put different weight on the player to distinguish the difference between players. For example, we could put more weight if they are in a configuration or with the ball. We could also set different weight on different teams. So this figure A is an example of a weighted matrix. However, this weighted matrix is still not enough for our purpose. The weighted matrix doesn't include the information about how close the squares were to each other. So we add this information by applying Gaussian blur on the image. The distance is then defined by the sum of the difference between the Gaussian and Blur image. In other words, the mathematically L1 norm. By changing the weight and the parameter of the Gaussian blur, we could focus on different aspects of a configurations. So as an example of clustering, we could put a weight of 10 on the player with the ball and put a weight of 5 on others player with the configuration. So the top panel of figure A is the weighted matrix of a configuration in these examples. And the bottom is blurred matrix. With this defined, which is the distance, we are almost ready for the clustering. But before the clustering, we partition the configuration using the number of players or whether or not the goalkeeper is contained in the configuration. There are two configurations in these pictures. The top one have 3 players with the goalkeepers, and the bottom one have 5 players without the goalkeepers. So they are in different partitions. And then for each partitions, we apply the clustering algorithm and attain a list of cluster for each of the partition, and then combine all of them together into a single list. In this single list of cluster, we sorted them based on the average X value on the field of all the configuration in the clusters. In this example, we clusters all the configuration with 3 to 6 players in the first half of one game. The figure C is one of the cluster with 3 players. As we can see, all of them are located on the top left corner of the field, and then the player with the ball are always on the top of the configuration. Now, if there's any question, just speak up. If not, I will just hand this back to Pfaff to talk about safe configuration graph using cluster as the vertices.
Okay, thank you. So now that we've categorized these safe configurations, right, which were these configurations where all the players considered the configuration have these safe passing lanes between each other, STEM, and we consider these safe because it's hard to stop a progression when there are a lot of options. It's like kind of underlying philosophy. And then what I wanted to move on to now is actually explaining the safe configuration graph. So this slide should look a little familiar, but now hopefully more of the words make sense. So we're going to start with vertices that are these, a cluster of, so a category of safe configurations. And then we're going to put a directed edge if I can get somewhere in the data we found. So for now, this is actually just historic that we found somewhere in the data that one went from a configuration, this configuration to that configuration. So now we kind of have this directed way to kind of encode kind of sequences of possible shifts between configurations. There are weights. The weights are currently the historic fraction of time that one goes. So we take all the nodes that one moves to from node A, and then we see what fraction of the time was it actually node B that one shifted into from node A. So that it was what we kind of had access to at this point. But right now it just kind of gets how frequent was that shift in the data, which says something about it being possible. Okay, so that's what the graph is. And one of the things that we'll talk about next in RA's examples, so we sometimes incorporate also a lose the ball node, which is basically, so you would have an edge from a configuration to the lose the ball node if at some point in the data, within 10 seconds of that configuration, there was a loss of possession. And so Ari will talk about in his examples a little bit that. And I think this is also a natural place for stopping if there are any questions so far. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to move on to Ari talking about, he's going to give some examples both of losing the ball, and then one of the things one can then look at are then chains of these safe configurations, and in particular he's going to focus in of chains of safe configurations that land in the 18-yard box. Okay, so without further ado, Ari.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, as Professor Pfaff mentioned, now I'll run through some examples of the information that we gained from about a real game from analyzing these certain configurations and certain chains of configurations using the two nodes that Professor Pfaff previously described, the lose the ball node and the in the box progression node. So these are three of the passing configurations that we found most likely to lead to lose the ball node, i.e. a loss of possession. In each of these configurations, the first thing we noticed was that there's only a single maximal passing clique in each case. So maximal passing clique is just where the maximum number of edges are in the graph based on the number of vertices. So you can see all the vertices have a path connecting to each other. And we hypothesized that this would lead to a higher probability of losing the ball, as we originally proposed that maximizing the number of passing cliques in a configuration would encourage progression and vice versa. Secondly, in each of the frames, the player with the ball is not offered a progressive pass option. As you can see in each of the diagrams, all his open teammates are behind him or parallel to him. Unfortunately, this common detail was not further analyzed, but intuitively, this would lead to more turnovers, since players are usually eager to progress the ball and will force passes to well-covered teammates because of their forward position. The last thing that is common between the configurations is the overwhelming number of defenders within about a meter of the ball carrier. If you look closely, in each of the cases, there are at least 3 blue defending players pressuring the ball carrier, most of them leaving their original assignments. In each case, it looks like the defense is making a collectively aggressive movement, closing in on the player with the ball, and moving upfield to cover opposing players who are in less dangerous positions, but they are close to the ball. We can see this strategy is particularly visible in the bottom configuration pictured. The blue team's backline has moved up all the way to about halfway up midfield, even though the ball is in the opponent's possession on their side of the field. You can see the blue right back in particular is leaving space between his defensive assignment on the weak wing there in order to provide added pressure on the ball. Also, that the blue team has 3 players closing right in on the ball, taking away any forward passing option. This strategy is aggressive and can lead to the opponent's scoring chance if it is not timed properly. As you can see, it leaves wide areas very vulnerable. But we know that these clusters are some of the most probable to reach the lose the ball node in the next progression, which indicates that the defending team in each case was successfully pressing high. Can I get to the next slide? I might have to stop screen sharing. Sorry.
Right. So,
Sorry about
yeah.
that. Keynote isn't working. So the other somewhat opposite factor that we analyzed to lose the ball node was the in the box progression nodes, which I guess is an opposite indicator that the offensive team's possession was successful. So we analyzed a few chains of cliques formed by attacking teams up the field that led to a frame where the team had achieved possession in the 18-yard box. And the following pictures are the first 2 frames of one of those chains. In figure 8 and 9, we see that the ball carrier decides to use some space in front of him, moving down the sideline, drawing pressure from the defender on that side. Looking at figure 8, you can see that the red team has 3 passing options available to the ball carrier in midfield, with 2 containing the maximal passing clique. This suggests that the red team has brought their midfield and attacking players close to the ball, allowing for maximal passing options. This style of play, close, quick passing, requires great skill in one-touch passing and dribbling, as the ball has to be moved around quickly to get around the defenders. However, in the first figure, we also see 6 blue defenders around the area of the passing clique. While this clique is a complete graph, any of the passing options receiving the ball are in a position to be quickly surrounded by defenders, meaning this clique isn't stable, and so the team has to shift their configuration if they want to extend their possession past the next play. This is exactly what they do. As you can see, the furthest passing option, who is the most difficult target for the ball carrier anyway, makes him move away from the ball to the middle of the field, drawing some of the defenders his way, creating space for the other passing options. You can see how effective this movement is as the ball carrier in figure 9 finds an open midfielder in figure 10. In figure 10 there, who now has the space to play several options. And with this extra space, you can see in figure 11, the ball carrier waits and allows for other attacking players to make dangerous runs in the box. In figure 11, a defender pressures the ball carrier, who just passed leaving the space behind him on the edge of the box exposed. The player who just passed the ball off takes advantage and runs into the space, receiving the ball just inside the 18-yard box, as shown in figure 12. This is a high-quality scoring opportunity since the ball carrier is in range of the net and also has multiple passing options nearby. So from this analysis, we realized that the constant movement of all players in the progression is what led to such success in this progression. When playing with a small radius of passing options, the opponent's defensive shape tightens as more passes are made. So you need movement to keep breaking their defensive shape and cause miscommunications between the defensive players. Now I'll give it back to Professor Pfaff to continue with the presentation.
Okay, right. So what Ari was giving is like 2 examples, right? So one being some high frequency, like some configurations that with high frequency led to a loss of possession. And then also a sequence of configurations that led into the 18-yard box. And so these are just kind of some examples of kinds of things that one could look at, using these, our models with the graphs, and then also we look at chains of configurations leading into the 18-yard box, as well as like the lose the ball node and the frequency of a configuration leading to that. And so these are just some examples of one could kind of pick things out and kind of analyze what's going on in them. And then what we want to look at next is, so as we said before, unfortunately, data was a bit wonky. And so the evidence that we really would have liked was we wanted to look at chains of configurations that led from the defensive third to the attacking third. And we wanted to see of all the times they went from the defensive third to the attacking third, what portion of those, went through these safe configurations, as well as, once one had a certain number of safe configurations, what were the chances that they were going to make it through? We wanted to look at these kinds of things because we would lose track. We had to throw out a lot of frames because of losing track of the ball and so on. It was harder to do things that that really required looking at a longer period of time. So instead, we tried different things to see whether we could do them with the data that we had, and this is what we landed on. And so, without further ado, we will hear from Zoe about this.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, as Professor Pfaff said, we want to find, we have this big rich data set, we have this model of sort of features that lead to successful things and particularly successful progression up the field. And so again, while we would have liked to directly, compute every single clique and then every progression, and then look at how often does, play start in defensive third and in the attacking third actually flow through a chain of configurations. Unfortunately, when you actually go to compute the chains, very frequently what you find is that halfway through the chain, the ball goes missing for 30 seconds. And suddenly you're not actually able to do a computation. And so we wanted to come up with other metrics for successful play and see if they can be predicted or represented by the presence of cliques and safe configurations. And so what we came up with was this notion of future possession probability. And so the basic idea is you looking at a moment in a game and you want to ask, what's the probability that some amount of time in the future, we still have possession? This is obviously a good thing, right? Possession is generally good, especially if you want to make progress up the field. And so our hope is to compute this for moments when you have a safe configuration and moments when you don't, compare those and see if the existence of a safe configuration leads to a higher probability of retaining possession in the future. And so the process we go through is we select a random game from the data set. We select a random moment in that game, so a frame. We identify the team in possession. Again, we just read that directly out of the data. We look some amount of time in the future, and we just check, does the same team have possession? And again, you'll notice the points with asterisks. Of course, when you actually look exactly 2 seconds in the future, let's say, very often what you find is that the ball isn't found, nobody has possession. And not because possession is contested, but just it's not available in the data. And so we have to make a slight modification. Instead of looking exactly 2, 3, 4 seconds in the future, you look that amount of time, you look at a window of time starting at that moment. And so instead of asking, does the team have possession in a single moment, you ask, does the team have sole possession in this window? And the hope is that somewhere in the window, a team has possession. We can do this process requiring that the initial frame has a clique, or sorry, a safe configuration. We can do this, and then we can also get a baseline of just all the data, and we can, again, do this test for when we require the initial frame doesn't have a clique. And this allows us to estimate the probability just by random sampling. And so when you actually run this test, what you find is you get this table. And the key takeaway here is in this column, we have the difference between the probability of retaining possession in the future when you have a clique right now versus when you don't. This is the difference column. And because these are all positive, our takeaway is that having having possession in a safe configuration leads to a higher probability of retaining possession. And we can see this occurs over quite a long time scale, actually. So this column here represents the amount of time in the future, the amount of time in the future you wait before looking at this window. And so you have a frame now, you wait, say, 33 seconds, then you look at this window. And even 33 seconds in the future, we see that having a safe configuration leads to a 2% higher chance of retaining possession. And while this isn't an astronomical number, it is, a real difference. And over the course of games, this will lead to, more successful play. We also repeated this test for different lengths of windows, so 1, 2, 3, 4 second windows. And even across those tests, we found, again, the same thing of having a safe configuration leads to a higher chance of retaining possession in the future. And so with that, I'll hand it back to Professor Pfaff.
Okay, so thank you, Zoe. So now I want to go into the final bit. As I said, I think I want to believe that the model that we created is more of a launch off point, a new kind of way of looking at things. So I want to talk about a few of these things that one may look at. So one of them would be a box differential configuration index. So now we're looking at a safe configuration or a node, and we want to develop a score that's going to tell us, so it wants to encode, so we can look at, so as already talked about, we could have chains of configurations that lead into the box, and how frequently is that configuration part of these chains of configurations that lead into the box? So does this have a lot of potential to lead into the box? And then on the other hand, I feel like you need to have both the potential to increase your success And then also you need to take into consideration the danger or the possibility that this is instead going to lead to the other team having success. So one should also take into consideration the chances of possession loss. So is this configuration frequently leading to possession loss? And then, how dangerous is that possession loss? Is the possession loss in a situation where the other team is likely to score based on it, from a counterattack? Another type of thing one could look at, so something one of the things I've been interested in also is if one's looking at paths that run from the defensive third to the attacking third, you want to know, right? So we're hoping that, yes, historically, I know that I went from this configuration to this configuration once, but maybe nobody yet has tried going from this configuration to this configuration, this configuration to this configuration. And so we're kind of trying to build new chains, and then you want to know how good are these chains, so that you can look for the best ways to move from the defensive third to the attacking third. So we want to place values on these. One of the things that I think that they should take into consideration is a penalty for taking too long to progress the ball. And I think, so one of the reasons that I think that this is important will be encoded in the next thing I say, which is that, the more passes that you have, the more chances there are for interception. The other part of this, though, is that, the longer that you're passing around the ball, the longer that the defensive team has to adjust to your attack and to either stop it or gain possession themselves. So I believe it should take that in consideration. Another thing that it can take into consideration is, again, this probability of possession loss. And then again, the risk caused by that. If we lose possession in this particular circumstance, how likely is the other team to score as a result of this loss of possession? So we already have kind of the success of this, path, because it did lead from the defensive third to the attacking third. But then we want to know what are the chances that instead it's going to go bad, and so on, to actually decide which of these paths one may want to use. Another thing one could look at should be possibly separating nodes. So one way a way to kind of think of that is that if I have this configuration and this configuration, and there's a path in the graph that goes from this configuration to this configuration, so a sequence of configurations one can go through. If I remove this particular configuration, can I still get from this configuration to this configuration? And there's a lot of reasons you may want to know that. One may even be if that portion of the graph has these kind of separating nodes, you may not want to use those paths, because if somehow or another you're not able to use that particular configuration, then there's no way to get from this configuration to this configuration. It could also give a focus point in terms of, we know we're going to have to go through here, so we should make sure we know how to do that shift between configurations there. Or as defensively, you could either try to force people into these configurations, or you can spend more focus on disrupting them, because they're kind of key to progressing through. I talked about the index of kind of progression into the box. There are some other, there are a lot of indices that you could create. High valence configuration. So if I have high incoming valence, there's a lot of ways to get to that configuration. And then if I have high outgoing valence, that tells me there's a lot of ways to proceed from that configuration, which again, kind of using this underlying philosophy that if there's a lot of different things that you can do, it's harder to stop you from progressing. It might be hard to prevent all of them at once. So there can be indices like this. Configuration seldom leading to ball loss. Inclusions in various different kinds of chains, things like this. Another part of this is that our focus was really on the model itself, and kind of moving from there. We had less of a focus on, in some sense, we're not yet proper data analysts. This is less of our focus. So there's a lot of data analytics techniques that one could use there. And part of that could actually be, can one improve the clustering using comparing different kinds of clustering, or different methods for deciding on the matrices we're going to cluster, things like this. For people with more tools and experience, this could be an interesting question. Another one could be, is it possible to adjust the edges to, for example, and also the clusters, so that you have that if I have two clusters here and I can get from this configuration to this configuration, should almost be an if and only if statement. I can get from this configuration to this configuration, if and only if I can get from that configuration to that configuration. So that would make this a more natural clustering, as well as creation of the edges that could use further data analytics techniques. Another thing would be to improve the weights on the edges. So right now I said they're kind of historic probabilities of something happening. But could they reflect a potential for success of that particular shift between configurations? As well as, again, this like danger if the ball is lost. So are they likely, is this shift likely to work well? And if not, how bad is it? And then there could be other new models building kind of with similar methodology or building off of this one. We don't talk about passing into space. We don't talk about, so movement within the 18-yard box should be very different than progressing up the field, which is what we really kind of focus on. And can one create similar kinds of models studying shifting between configurations that's focused on the kinds of movements one might make within the 18-yard box, and so on. So those were just a few of the ideas. We hope that there's many more. And so with that, I want to say thank you for your time and attention, as well as also thank you to everybody who we talked with in the process of working through these and creating the models and so on. Okay.
Thanks very much, Dr. Pfaff and Ari and Zoe and Howie for your talk. So we'll open it up for questions. So you can either post in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask away. Maybe while we're waiting, I'll just ask about, you kind of alluded to it a little bit at the end there in terms of passing into space, but this assumes that all passes are along the ground and not in the air. Is that right?
Yeah, that's another thing that I didn't put in there. We're assuming passes, ground passes, and then also we didn't take into consideration aerial passes.
And have you, and again, it's possible I missed this, but like, have you looked at, and maybe it's inherent in your method, but like just, for different parts of the field, are there certain configurations that tend to occur in the defensive end and then certain configurations that occur in the offensive end? So as you move down, like you're shifting the configuration types, I guess, especially as the defense is going to tighten up, you're getting tighter and tighter spatially with the other players in the field.
Yeah, it's interesting. So one of the things that we did was, I believe that the configurations ended up not being like translation invariant, as in we actually took into consideration where they are on the field, and which I actually initially thought, oh, we should just make them translation invariant, like put them all, the same cluster if they would be the same but in a different part of the field. We didn't do that, and maybe one of the things you're, saying is relevant for that. Because we really are encoding, can this configuration, this location come after this configuration in this location? But also within the indices and so on, another thing that I didn't mention that I think could also be important is, if you're assigning weights to edges, is this actually progressing you up the field? And so on. But yeah, so for now, actually, because like almost by design, we actually know where we are in the field, but you could also analyze that a little bit more.
On the point of translation invariance, a large reason why the configurations right now sort of include the position of every player, it just mostly has to do with how our distance metric works. When we're computing the distance between two configurations, we look at the position of each player in the configuration on the field. We represent the field as essentially an 80 by 120 matrix where each pixel of the field, or each 1 meter by 1 meter square, is sort of a pixel, and we put a value in that cell if there's a player in the configuration. And then we just take the entry-wise difference of those two matrices. In order to do this with something where you can have sort of, you move the shape up the field a large distance and end up with the same configuration, we would need to find a place to sort of center this matrix. And it was sort of beyond the scope of what we were doing. I will say with the Gaussian blurring, because of essentially we take each player from being located at a point to being sort of located in a fuzzy circle. And because of that, you get some translation invariant, or some sort of ability to move the configuration around without it changing too much. So we do have some element of that, but it's not fully involved right now. But if you were to come up with a different way to cluster in a different distance metric, then it's entirely conceivable that you could have full ability to move the configuration around and create these chains sort of in that way.
So I'm looking at Elijah's question. You can also speak it. I think that's a very interesting thought that we didn't do, which is to have a node for like, free kick maybe or corner, and then that's like a starting state. We kind of thought in general about, so one of the things we also didn't look at was having starting states and ending states, so that you really could talk about even just like a configuration of players in the defensive third and put values on the starting states, as well as saying all the ways that I could go from this particular starting state to this terminal state, ending state. And those could actually be, a starting state could actually be something more like a free kick or a corner.
I think too, like it's kind of an easier question. You don't need as much of the tracking data, but like especially with kind of the way the ball can rebound, maybe your kind of configuration states can pick up like, okay, if you stand in these kind of positions, you're likely to get the ball for rebound or a header or whatever. But anyways, thanks for talking. It was great.
Hey, Devin.
Hey, yeah. So while you're constructing the graphs for the safe configurations, you mentioned how we're assuming that the passes were instantaneous. Now, obviously that assumption is made for like simplicity of the analysis, but like, I'm curious how the research could change if you were to incorporate ball travel times.
Yeah, and I think that's one of these things that I think at some point we talked about in like a list of things that would make more sense, is that if you're talking about like I want to pass the ball here and then that person passes the ball there should be a delay time. So also if we're taking into consideration, so I think this was Ari who kind of pointed out more or less at some point that what we could do both for passing into space, and then it would work for this too, is you have a player, instead of just kind of being a point in the field, there could kind of be a region of that player that's like where this player could run to or whatever. So like their space, and then consider that entire space to be where you could be passing into, and where that space is would alter based on the time it takes for the ball to get from here to here and there to there. And so in evolving the model, so that was kind of a little bit in the like passing into space thing and so on, is changing the locations of players to really be a space that makes sense for them. So that could definitely be incorporated into the model. I think that would be interesting to do so.
Yeah, like you should have nodes not just for each player, but also each potential like area of passable regions. Like say if an attacking player was standing behind a defender, I could pass to that player by going on either side of that defender, and those could be two separate nodes instead of a single player node.
Yeah, like different potential passes. I like that. Yeah, interesting.
Okay, other questions from the audience? Okay, well, if there isn't, let's all thank Dr. Pfaff and her students again for a great presentation, and I'll just stop the recording now. Thanks very much, everyone.